Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming on Saturday, very early, in a very cold room to see my talk. The talk, as you can see, is called To Catch a Spy. My name is Tyler Hudak. Some of you may know me. I've been in information security for about 19 years now. I currently work on the blue team. I have taught the malware analysis class here at Derbycon for a number of years and elsewhere as well. I have authored a malware analysis course on Pluralsight, and in addition to that, I am a huge gaming geek and nerd, so we're going to be talking about malware in this talk, but if you want to talk gaming afterwards, please hit me up. I'm always for that. So I work on the blue team for a major medical institution in the U.S., and of course I need to put in the standard disclaimer that all information contained in this presentation is done on my own. It does not represent the experiences or views of my employer. So in other words, just because I'm talking about this stuff does not mean that we saw it at work. This is also another warning. I am not 100% clear on the rules surrounding U.S. government clearance. We will be talking about information that was released by Wikileaks, which was, I believe, classified information. So if this is going to affect you, feel free to leave. I will not be offended. I just wanted to throw this up there just in case it would affect anybody. I don't see anybody really running out, so I think we're good. So, some of you may have remembered that in March of this year, Wikileaks dumped what they called the Vault 7 Euro0 dump. And this was essentially documentation from the CIA's hacking arsenal. It went through a lot of different details as to what malware they had, the tools that they used, and so on. And one of the things that I saw when this was initially released was that a lot of people, especially in the media, were saying just how advanced all of these things were, and how amazing these techniques were, and how they were undetectable. They were APT level. There's, this is why the blue teams aren't able to detect all of this stuff. And so I got kind of interested in it, and so I went out and I looked, and what you see here on the right-hand side are all of the different persistence and RE avoidance or hiding techniques that were used. And I started looking at these, and I was, and then looking over at the articles that were coming out and things that some people were tweeting about, how advanced they were, and I was like, no. The techniques that the CIA details out here have been around for a long time. Not only that, they're used by commodity malware constantly. Some of these techniques are from the 80s. So I wanted, the whole point of my talk is to really just show that these techniques are being used and we can detect them. One could venture that the reason the CIA is, detailing these is not because they're easy, and some of them are easy techniques, as we'll hopefully see, but that they're effective. And the reason they're effective is because our protections are protecting us against it, or we don't know how to look for them. And so, in this talk, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to go over these techniques here. I kind of handpicked 5 of the more interesting ones, at least from my perspective, and ones that I have seen in malware and some of the response that I've done. And we're going to kind of go into how they work and what tools you can use to detect them on your systems and your network. And so, like I said, none of these techniques in the Year Zero documents are new. All of them we can detect in some way during incident response or forensics. So there are a couple prerequisites, though, you need to have set up in order to detect these types of things. First off, you need logging. You need to log your data in order to see it. If you're not logging your data, either through a SIM or even just locally on your system, then obviously you're not going to have the evidence that you need to detect some of these attacks. Second, you need visibility into your systems, either in real time or forensically. You either need to be able to have some type of maybe like an EDR type system that allows you to query your environment to see if a specific registry key is set, or to be able to connect to that system remotely and through something like an encase or a remote disk mounter, where you can grab the registry files back or grab certain files back in order to analyze them. And then finally, you need the knowledge of what to look for, and really that's what I'm going to focus here in this talk. We're going to talk about how these techniques work and how you can detect them. The logging and the visibility we'll briefly touch on. We'll talk about some of the tools, but we're really going to focus on the knowledge portion. And I also want to say this, that we're not going to focus on every tool or technique available to detect these attacks because there just isn't time. There are some which are kind of obvious that we're not going to talk about. Antivirus, EDR systems that are becoming more and more popular now. These should give you the ability to detect or either on your own or through signatures that they have these types of attacks. Don't always, but those are some obvious techniques that I'm just not even going to go into. All right. So first one we're going to talk about are image file execution options. This is a setting in the registry. If you're not sure where it is, it's in HKLM. So I'm gonna be throwing out a lot of acronyms about the registry. HKLM is the H-key local machine hive. This typically contains system level settings. The interesting thing about anything in HKLM, per my experience and research, is you have to have administrative privileges in order to write into it. So if you see any of these attacks that are going after HKLM, that means that the attacker has to have an admin privileges in order to use this attack. We'll also talk about HKU or HKCU. These are the user hives. And at some point we're going to talk about HKCR, which is the class root hive, which I'll get into that in a couple slides after. But image file execution options, I just abbreviated IFEO, is a registry key at HKLM, software, Microsoft, Windows NT, current version, and then image file execution options. And if you go to that in the registry, you're just going to see a whole bunch of program names. Likely. They auto-populate through various means, so every program you've ever run will not be in there. But the entire purpose, or one of the purposes for this registry key is to be able to attach a debugger to a program before it runs. And you'll know that it's doing that because you'll see under the program, you'll see a value for debugger. And if you see that value there, it'll lead to a program. And what happens is that program is run just prior to any time the program that key is specified is run. So in the example we have here, I've got AcroRead32, Adobe Acrobat, set up. There's a debugger key, and the value points to some debugger.exe. Anytime that I ran AcroRead32, the debugger would get run prior to it. Now, that's the purpose of the debugger key. Now, attackers will use this to launch backdoors. They'll put a backdoor as the debugger, so for something like maybe Explorer, so that anytime Explorer runs, which it auto starts when you start up the computer, the backdoor automatically gets run. Think of this as being analogous to the run key within the registry. Attackers will also use it to prevent security tools from running. So if I know a security tool's process name or file name like procmon.exe, a very popular tool process monitor used to analyze malware, I can set this up for procmon.exe, and I can set a debugger to either to my own program, which will automatically crash. And so what happens, or even a non-existent program, so what happens is when I run procmon.exe, Windows sees that there's a debugger key, it tries to run the debugger, and the debugger either crashes or doesn't even allow procmon to launch. And so that's a way that attackers can get around shutting down some of your defenses, like antivirus programs and so on. This is not new. This has been around. The earliest instance I could find of this was an Ars Technica article from 2000. So we're talking almost 20 years now that this technique has been used. How many people in here have heard of sticky keys? Awesome. This is how sticky keys works. Sticky keys is a backdoor. The attacker will create a key for sethc.exe, which is the executable that's run when you hit shift 5 times. They'll set the debugger to command.exe. You can also do this by, instead of sethc, by doing it for utilman.exe, which is what happens when you hit Control-U. Set it to cmd.exe. You hit shift 5 times, and a command prompt loads up. Now, again, because this is the HKLM key, the HK local machine hive, you need administrative privileges in order to do this. So the attacker is going to have to somehow escalate privileges or get the user to click, yes, go ahead and run me as an administrator. which is probably what's going to happen. So how do we detect this? Well, very simply, we just need to look for the debugger keys under the IFEO registry keys. Microsoft Autoruns is great to do this. Microsoft Autoruns has this built in. You run it, and it will, under the image hijacks tab, it will have any image file execution options that have the debugger set up there for you. RegRipper, if you're not familiar with that, is a great forensic tool to analyze the registry that's built in. And then just even going in manually and looking at the registry itself. The one that I like to use is called Registry Explorer. It's by a gentleman named Eric Zimmerman. I believe he already has, the nice thing about Registry Explorer is there are bookmarks built into it. And I believe this is one of the bookmarks. So all you have to do is load up the HKLM Hive, go to the bookmarks, and it will jump right to it, and then you can see what's there. Logging. You can also detect this through logging. So I've had trouble detecting when it was executed through logging. There are ways to do it, but it's not as easy. But you can very easily detect when this value is being set through logging. You just set up the registry auditing. You go into the registry and audit for set value changes on all of the IFEO hives. And then you watch for security event ID 4657. And whenever you see, which is a registry set value or modification. Whenever you see that, go and look at those logs and see what the value is set to. If it's set to a regular debugger, then you probably have a programmer that's just debugging something. If it's set to command.exe or some other program you don't recognize, then you probably have an issue. So I will have a link up to this later, but if you are not familiar with logging or how to set logging in Windows, go to malwarearchaeology.com. Michael Goff, who runs the site, has a large number of amazing cheat sheets on how to set up all this logging. So throughout this presentation, I also have all the resources that I use to gather this information or assist me in my research, so that I will admit I'm standing on the shoulders of giants as I present this, because a lot of people have already done a lot of this research, and I'm just kind of condensing it into one format. So that is the first attack. It's image file execution options. That one was fairly simple. We're going to move to something a little bit more complicated, and that's shell extensions. So Windows itself is the default shell for, Explorer is the default shell for Windows. Whenever you log into a Windows system, the desktop that you have there, everything that's running is typically run by Explorer.exe, or a lot of it is run by Explorer.exe. It provides the desktop and file services, but you can extend Explorer to have more capabilities. You typically see this if you go into Windows Explorer, the file manager, and right-click on a file, and you can see all the different extra menu items there. So if you install 7-zip, you're going to have some things in there. If you install Notepad++ or any other tools, and you right-click on any file, you're going to have all those options. Those are shell extensions. And there are a lot of different shell extensions that you can create. There are menu shell extensions, there are icon shell extensions, property handlers, drag and drop handlers, shortcut. I mean, there's just a whole huge list. Microsoft has a great article on MSDN on how to do all this and everything that you can do it for. But obviously, if we can add a normal shell extension, then attackers can add their own as well. And the nice thing about the shell extensions is, because they're hooked into Explorer, they will start up when Explorer starts up, which is when the system boots up. Some handlers work better than others, so your mileage may vary, but this is definitely done by malware. So let's look into how this is done. So let me talk about how you register an extension initially. So first, you're going to generate a CLS ID, which is essentially just a unique ID, and add it to HKCR /CLS ID. All you're doing is you're going in there, you're creating the CLS ID, and you're adding it under a key called inproc server 32, where the default value is pointed to the DLL that handles the extension. Once you do that, you have to assign the file or shell object to your CLS ID, and you do this by going into HKCR again, there are various places you can go in there. If you've ever gone into the HKCR Hive, you'll see it start with the little asterisk, which I think is kind of the, catch-all for anything, and then you'll see a whole bunch of extensions as well as some other entries, and somewhere in there is where the shell extension gets registered. It all depends on what you're registering. But once you do that, you actually have to approve the CLS ID. You have to say within Windows that, yes, this is a shell extension that I am going to allow to run. And you do that in HKLM, software, Microsoft Windows, current version, shell extensions / approved. And I apologize for the abbreviations on some of these. It's really hard to put those really long registry keys in there and fit everything onto the screen. But notice something here. You know, we're registering a normal extension. We're doing this all in HKCR and HKLM, which you need elevated privileges to add into. If you've ever installed something like 7-zip, at some point you usually get a prompt saying, can this program make changes to the operating system? And that's you giving it permission to add this stuff in. So this is how you normally do it. Obviously this is nice for attackers if they can get into it. But there's an issue here. You know, modifying these two hives, they require administrative privileges. And either, hopefully, we're locking our users out of administrative privileges, or they're smart enough not to click yes for something that they didn't go in and install. So the solution here, or Windows actually provides a very nice solution for this. So HKCR, so let me jump back a second. HKCR is the thing in the middle. It's where you add in all of the different CLS IDs and the shell extensions where they live. And typically this lives in its own hive, which again requires administrative privileges. But Windows actually does something funny. It will actually check the user's hive before it checks the system HKCR hive for these shell extensions and for these CLS IDs. If you've ever installed something and it asks you, do you want to install this for all users or just you? This is what that's from. Install it for just you means that it's installing it into your registry hive as opposed to the system registry hive. So the bonus for this is, since Windows is checking the hive first, our hive first, we can add into it, or our attacker who's running something as us can add something into that without elevated privileges. And as a side effect, thank you Microsoft, you don't need to approve the CLS ID if it's in the current user hive. So this means the attacker can add shell persistence or shell extension persistence to HKCU without approving it. And the hive that goes into is HKCU/software/classes. So an example, this is actually taken from malware. All we have to do is add the CLS ID to HKCU, and we do that under HKCU classes, CLS ID, whatever the CLS ID number is, and then in proc server. And as you can see here, there's it points to a DLL in program data called umpo.dll. This, like I said, this was actually taken from malware. There is a legitimate DLL called umpo.dll, but I believe it lives in system32, not in some program data directory. After you do that, you just add the extension dependent keys that it needs. Each shell extension may require its own things. In this case, I had to add something to HKCU software classes, drive, shellx folder extensions, and then the CLS ID. It's cut off a little bit, but and those of you in the back may not be able to see this, but the CLS ID on both are the same. The thing to take away from this is you're only doing this to your own hive. You're not doing it to any system hive, and so it will happily let you add it without asking for administrative privileges. And we don't need to approve it. We don't need to add anything to HKLM to approve it. And so once we do this, if we go in through the registry editor or any registry editor and start looking at HKCR, which is this virtual hive that's kind of combined from a number of different places, including our own, we can see that our the malicious CLS ID, the 118BED and so on, is in the HKCR hive, which means that Windows has found it and is seeing it as something that's registered within the operating system. Persistence at a system level without having to worry about elevating privileges. So how do we detect this? Well, we really just need to go in. This one is a little bit more difficult to detect. We can examine all of the different keys related to extensions and look for anything out of the ordinary. And unfortunately, that's kind of the best way to do it. One thing that I would recommend, if you can get a memory dump, or if you're lucky enough to have a utility that allows you to query memory in real time, is to look at the DLLs that are loaded in Explorer.exe, because all of these malicious DLLs will be loaded into Explorer. And if you see something that doesn't make sense, a DLL that looks like that's in a directory where it shouldn't be, especially like a user directory, focus in on that one. Unfortunately, autoruns misses this. Autoruns is an amazing tool, but it's not the end-all be-all of persistence detection. There is a lot of stuff that it misses. Now, autorun will find shell extensions that are in the HKLM registry, the system-level registry. For some reason, it does not look at the user registry. Or if it does, I have not been able to figure out how to do it. So I ran autoruns on my PC that I had infected with this malware, looked for that DLL, and the only one that it found was the legitimate DLL. And some of you may be thinking, well, it's the same name, maybe, maybe Windows won't load the same extension DLL if it's an extension DLL if it's the same name as something else is already loaded. I've tried it with multiple different names that didn't exist, and none of them showed up in here. So unfortunately, autoruns misses this one. If you're performing a forensic examination, there is something really cool about this. In the user Hive software, Microsoft Windows current version shell extensions, there is a registry key called cached. And this contains a list of all the shell extensions that have been loaded, including the time it was first loaded. So we can dump everything within this key, pull out the timestamps, and just do a timestamp analysis to see if when the look at the things that weren't first loaded when the system was built. If you see something really recent, then that could be your malware. There's a great script at this link on GitHub that once you extract it, it will kind of parse it out for you and give you a nice little timeline analysis of this. So you can easily go in and see that, and so you don't have to try to manually do all this. In addition, so if you're not aware, most people are aware of the user Hive ntuser.dat. It's contained in the user's directory. ntuser.dat typically contains most of everything. Well, there's a second registry file for users called userclass.dat. That's buried down somewhere. I think it's AppData local Microsoft or one of the AppData directories. But make sure you grab that when you're doing a forensic examination as well, because that's where all the CLS IDs that users have are stored. It's not stored in the ntuser.dat file. So here are the resources. Any questions so far? Awesome. So next we're going to talk about DLL Search Order. This is another attack that has been used for a number of years, and we'll just go into how it works. So when Windows loads DLLs, or when a program loads into memory, in the import address table, it has a number of DLLs that it wants loaded. Well, if you've ever looked at an import address table, the import address table does not specify where those DLLs are. So Windows has to have some way in order to figure out where on the operating system those DLLs are. And the way that it works is, first it will query this registry key, the known DLLs registry key. And it will look to see if the DLL it's trying to load is in there. And this is essentially a key that contains a list of very well-known system DLLs and where they're located at. If they're in here, if they're listed in here, then they're typically in Windows System 32. Although I believe there is a mechanism to kind of say, no, this one is over here somewhere else. But if if the program doesn't find it in there, then it starts to look in specific places in the operating system. So let's say we have a program called runme.exe, and it's trying to load a DLL called loadme.dll. So the first place it looks is the directory where the program exists. So if your program exists in program files / good file or good program, it's going to look in that directory first for that DLL. If it doesn't see it there, then it looks in System 32. So it'll look here in either System 32 or Windows sysfile 64. And it may look in, the reason it may look in either is because Windows will transparently remap connections into System32 on a 64-bit Windows systems for 32-bit programs into SysWow64. Basically what's going on here is when you run a 32-bit program in a 64-bit Windows, it's actually running under an emulator, and the System32 directory on a 64-bit Windows system contains 64-bit libraries. Well, 32-bit programs can't use 64-bit libraries, and so all the 32-bit programs are stored in SysWow64. Makes sense, huh? Let's put all the 64-bit things in Windows or System32 and vice versa. But if you're watching this in something like Process Monitor and it's running a 32-bit program, you'll see it go to SysWow64 as opposed to System32. So just yeah, that tends to screw up some people sometimes. It's just the way that the operating system works. But after the directory of the program, it goes to System32. Then it'll look in Windows System. Then it'll look in Windows. And then it will look in the current directory that you're executing the program from. So let's say you executed the program from the root of C. It will then look in the root of C. And then finally, if it doesn't find it, it looks in your path, all the directories in your path environment variable. So let's say I'm an attacker. And the legitimate loadme.dll is in the path somewhere. If I can somehow get a malicious loadme.dll somewhere before that, then Windows is going to load my malicious DLL before the legitimate one. And so run me, let's say we have this set up on our system, that somehow in the current directory, the attacker has loaded a malicious loadme DLL. Runme.exe is going to look in the directory of the program, System32, System, Windows, and then finally in the current directory where it's going to find a loadme.dll. It's going to load that one instead of the legitimate one, which is the malicious one, which all of a sudden now we have malicious code running. When this happens, the attackers typically, the malicious backdoors that are set up like this, will typically have something where they'll either proxy all of the functions that are in that DLL to the real DLL, so it looks like the functionality is still there, or they pick a DLL that hardly anyone uses, and so they don't care if they actually proxy. They don't even try to proxy the real functions. They just do all the malicious stuff. And there is a very well-known example of this in Explorer.exe with a DLL called fxsst.dll. And this is, I believe, the fax DLL for Explorer. Well, Explorer lives in C:\Windows. The fxsst.dll lives in System32. So, as an attacker, remember one of the first places it looks is the directory of the program, which is C:\Windows. So if I can put my malicious DLL into C:\Windows, then Explorer is going to load that before it loads the legitimate one, and now I have access into Explorer. Now, obviously, with something like this, I need admin privileges to write into C:\Windows. Excuse me. However, there are lots of different instances where normal user programs are subject to this vulnerability. In addition to that, I have also seen malware that will drop a legitimate program, like an antivirus program, that is subject to this. They'll drop that onto in a directory and then drop a malicious DLL that it loads right next to it. And then the persistence mechanism will be starting up that legitimate binary. And that legitimate binary starts up, it loads the malicious DLL. And so if you're looking at auto runs or you're looking at the process in memory, you're going to see this legitimate binary. If you verify the signature on it, it's going to verify because it's the legitimate binary. It just has this a malicious DLL loaded into it. Now, there's also another version of this attack called a DLL sideloading attack, and I'm going to be honest with you. I have done a lot of research into what the difference between the load order library attack is and what DLL sideloading attacks are. And I can't find a difference. The only thing that I can figure out is with DLL sideloading attacks, the assemblies, the programs that are loaded with .NET programs are specified in what's called a manifest. And the manifest the load order for the manifest follows something very similar to our DLL load order. In fact, it's probably the exact same order. And so it's really just the only difference I can find out is if it's the DLL that's being loaded is specified in the import address table versus the manifest. If anybody knows for sure about that, please pull me off after, because even the reports on this that I can find contradict themselves. So, but it's essentially the same thing for our purposes. This has been used for a lot of different malware, PlugX, HTTP browser, Sakula, Metasploit has this in it. So there are a lot of things that are already using this. So how do we detect this? One of the best ways that I found is to do it with Volatility, to do memory analysis. I love Volatility. It's amazing. There are a number of different plugins that you can look for, that use it to look for DLL list, which lists out all the DLLs for a process, file scan, which lists all the files that were loaded for a process. So just go in and look to see what DLLs were loaded for within the files. And then you can also use prefetch. Prefetch is something within Windows where within the first 10 seconds that a program loads, it's going to kind of record all the files that it accesses, so it can so that's cache and it can load up really fast next time. In theory, the malicious DLL should be in prefetch. Not always, though. But here's an example. I've got explorer.exe. You can see I ran Volatility, and I just dumped out the process list. I used the pslist command, and it's running as PID 1976. So then I go and I run DLL list for it, and you can see at the very bottom we have our malicious DLL being loaded. Because remember, the legitimate FX SST DLL is in System32, not in Windows. So now we've detected that we have a malicious DLL loaded. In addition to that, look at what DLLs are loaded, in real time. A lot of EDR systems do this. If you get on a system, use one of the best tools for this, Process Explorer. You can go in there and look at all the DLLs that are loaded. And in this case, I have Explorer running. If you go down to, you can see at the very bottom, FX SST is loaded from the incorrect path. And there are a number of other places that you can, or a number of other things that you can use. There's timeline analysis. Just look at the file timestamps on a system. A DLL pops up around the time of the compromise. That should set off some flags. Look for DLLs in odd locations. I mentioned prefetch, but there's one thing I want to mention about prefetch. Prefetch isn't always there. Prefetch and superfetch and ReadyBoost and all of the stuff that Windows uses to kind of cache what a program does can be turned off in certain instances. I think with Windows 7 and beyond, maybe even Vista and beyond, if you have a solid-state drive, prefetch is turned off by default. I even think in maybe Windows 10 or maybe it's one of the earlier ones, prefetch by default is turned off. So don't rely on prefetch being there. In addition to that, I have done some, I've looked, when I was putting together these examples, I found it in the malicious DLLs in Process Explorer and Volatility and so on, but when I looked in prefetch, it wasn't listed in there. So it really depends on a lot of things. So don't rely solely on prefetch. My resources. Okay, so now we're going to move into something that's a bit more difficult to find, which is the volume boot record persistence. Before I go on, are we good so far? No, any questions? If you have any questions, just raise your hand throughout it. Yes? Yes. Okay, so the question was, with shell extensions, the user, you don't need administrative privileges to write into the user's hive, which is how it works. So if another user logs on there, will that malicious extension be loaded for that specific user? No, it shouldn't, because it's very specific to that user's hive. Each user will have a different hive. And so let's say I got infected on my system. Sorry, it's a bug. I got infected on my system with shell extensions. It's loaded into my hive. You then log onto the system under your ID. Unless there's some other persistence mechanism going on to infect you, my hive will not affect you. That's actually another good point, too. If you use roaming profiles, every system the user logs on with something like that, that system will be compromised as well. So when you're doing a incident response, look everywhere the user has logged on. You may not just be dealing with one system that's been compromised. Okay. Yes? It can be. So the question was for the DLL load order, is the current directory the same as the program of the directory? Is that right? It can be, but not always. So So if you're launching it from a GUI, I honestly don't know what they consider the current directory. I'll admit that. If you're launching it from like a command line, the current directory is going to be the directory you're in. I suspect that it might, for a GUI program, the current directory might be where the program lives, but I don't know that for sure. All right, let's get into volume boot record persistence. So let's talk about the Windows boot record, or boot sequence. So we've got our hard drive, right, that has our operating system on it. And on this hard drive, we have a number of different things on it. We have the first sector of the disk, and we have a number of different partitions. And one of these partitions is going to be marked as bootable. Well, when you press power on the computer, the BIOS starts up, and it's going to look for what's called the MBR, the master boot record, which lives in disk sector 0. Disk sectors, the size of them, are dependent upon the operating system and how you formatted the disk. In my experience, they tend to be about, I think, 1 or 4K, maybe a bit smaller or larger. Again, it all depends, and you can query that. But the master boot record, it contains the partition table, so it has the table that shows where each partition is located, how big they are, and so on. But it also contains master boot code. And what this code does, so the BIOS basically finds the master boot record, loads it into memory, and starts running the master boot code. The master boot code then goes through the list of partitions and finds the bootable active partition. When it does that, it looks at the first 16 sectors of that partition. Now, the first 16 sectors contains what's called the volume boot record. Now, understand that the volume boot record is on the partition. It's not at disk sector 0. So disk sector 0 is like the very beginning of the disk, whereas the partition could be anywhere on the disk. Now, the volume boot record, it contains basically some information about the partition. The sector 0 will contain the actual volume boot record, which is essentially just a bunch of data structures. And then sectors 1 through 15 will contain what's called the IPL, the initial program loader. And the initial program loader is code that put there by the operating system, which will then know how to load up the operating system and so on. I say that the first 16 sectors of the partition are reserved. From what I understand and from what I've seen, the VBR usually does not contain all 16 sectors. It's usually only about half that, but it reserves it for future, I guess. But once the volume boot record runs, it calls up the IPL, the initial program loader, which then eventually calls the OS. So very high-level view of how the Windows boot sequence works. So how do the bad guys use this? Well, they're gonna infect or compromise this process in one of two ways. They're either going to put malicious code into the master boot record, or they're going to put malicious code into the volume boot record. And the advantage of this is, well, first off, their malicious code is going to be running before the operating system runs. So if the attackers can get their malicious code in here, you're pwned right as you press the power button. And by doing that, they can bypass all of the security protections that you have in your operating system. In addition to that, when this code is running, it's running at ring 0, which means that it has the highest privileges on any system. So not only is this malicious code running before your operating system or before any of your protections, it's running with higher privileges or the same privileges as the kernel. Yes?
So this attack would still be effective if you had multiple OSs installed on the drive?
Yes, exactly. The comment was this attack would still be effective if you had multiple OSs on your drive. Absolutely. Now, I'm going to admit ignorance here. I don't know if there are any bootkits that can do that. I'm sure there are. In addition to that, so you get a compromised system. What's typically done? You reimage it, right? Make sure your reimage process is overwriting the MBR and the VBR. If you're not, and there's a bootkit on there, then you can install Windows as many times as you want, or reinstall Windows as many times as you want. You're not going to get rid of the compromise. So the advantages that I talked about. Now, the WikiLeaks data that was dumped on this, or the Vault 7 information that was dumped on this, said that they base their code off of some malware called Carperb. Carperb is a bootkit, and the interesting thing about that is its source code was leaked. And I believe I have a link to that source code here at some point. So Carperb basically allows you to, its capabilities are to load drivers and code. You can either load unsigned drivers, so you can bypass all the kernel protections for needing signed drivers. It can hide from the OS. Obviously, it's a bootkit. It's going to hide things like filtering out data and operating system calls. And Carperb even has an encrypted file system that's located on disk. I believe you can have it either located in unallocated space at the end of the disk where there's not even a partition, because there's usually some of that on a drive, or it's somewhere else in the in unallocated sectors. Interestingly, the initial version of Carperb, or of how Vault 7 implemented this, did not implement the encrypted file system. However, there was just something released a couple weeks ago from Wikileaks called Angelfire from Vault 7, where it appears that they actually do have this implemented in there. So how do we detect this? Really, look at memory analysis. Unfortunately, it's a lot easier to detect MBR bootkits than VBR bootkits. Probably because VBR bootkits are more recent. So use Volatility. There's an MBR parser to find it. There's not one. The best way that I found, and it's not really the best way, but it's one way, is to snapshot your MBR and your VBR and just verify it on occasion, because it should not be changing. Maybe when you install a Windows update, like a service pack or something like that, but outside of that, if you see a change to it, then something's going on. One way to do this, this is Derbycon. I have to throw up something PowerShell. So there is a great suite of utilities called Power Forensics. It will allow you to basically do a DD in PowerShell, and so you can grab out the appropriate sectors and then just MD5 hash them or SHA-1 hash them, whatever you want to do, and then verify them occasionally. This screenshot here is how to grab the MBR. This one is how to grab the VBR. So I'm getting close to running out of time. We have one more to get through, so I'm going to go a little bit faster right now. But I saved the best for last. I love this thing, process hollowing. This is an RE avoidance technique. It's very cool. So how does this work? When you load a program, when a program gets loaded into memory, there's a data structure called the PEB, the Process Environment Block. And this contains a lot of different information that the operating system needs about where things for the program are. One place is there's a data structure called process parameters, and it has a field called image path name, which basically goes to where the file is on disk. It's the path to it. And then you also have the image base address, which contains where the program is or starts in memory. So this would be a memory location, like here we have hex 400,000 or whatever I have there, and that's in memory where it should be. So how does malware use this? Well, a malware, when it wants to do process hollowing, it will start up a program, but it will start it up in what's called suspended mode. You can see there the call is create process, where it gives it a flag called create suspended. And essentially what happens here is the program starts up, but it doesn't do anything. It loads itself into memory, the operating system loads itself into memory, but there's no execution that happens. So once that happens, we have the suspended process in memory. The malware, because it launched that one, it has rights over it because it's a child process, will then remove the memory for the malware, or I'm sorry, for the legitimate program, create a new block of memory over there, trying to do it at the same place, and then it will write its malicious code into that memory. So essentially what you have here is you have a legitimate process shell up there that the malware has just copied its executable code into. And then it calls resume thread, which starts the program back up, and then you have a legitimate looking program for all intents and purposes in memory, which is actually executing malicious code. So hopefully this works. I've got an example of it here. Let's see if it's all right. So we've got Process Explorer here running. I've got my malware on the left-hand side that I'll click on in a second, and I've got Procmon running. Watch the malware process. It loads up DLLhost.exe, and you can see that Process Explorer sees that it's in suspended mode. Notice that I'm also verifying the signature on the file that's being run, and it's verified. The malware launched DLL host again. It launched Explorer underneath it, but all of those were verified. I found this out in my class this week. If you go into Process Monitor does not log whether or not it was launched in suspended mode. And I have yet to find something that shows that it logs it in suspended mode. So I'm still looking for that. I'm hoping Sysmon will have that in there. It doesn't so far, but there's always feature requests. Awesome. So obviously the advantages of this is the image path name does not change. And that's how a lot of utilities will go and look for, will verify signatures on process in memory. Because even if the program is code signed, in memory you can't verify that signature on the memory running or the process running in memory, because things are changing around. The code signature would fail. And so programs like Process Explorer, they see where the program is pointing to, where the path name is pointing to, and it verifies the signature that way. Well, the path name still points to the legitimate program, and so it verifies. And like we saw, outside of the actual process creation that we saw in Process Explorer, I haven't found anything yet to record this, to record that it was launched in suspended mode. So how can we detect this? Best way that I found so far is Volatility. So let's see if this works. There we go. All right, so I'm running a plugin called hollowfind. It's not a default plugin in Volatility, but its sole purpose is to go in and look for hollowed processes. And it's really nice. It'll go through, it kind of went through there pretty quickly, but it shows you all the processes that it thinks are hollowed. It shows you similar processes. It shows you the initial dump of the instructions. It doesn't find everything, so I ran it on the same thing that you guys saw. It found the DLL hosts that were executed. It did not find explorer.exe that had also been executed as a hollowed process. But that could also be by the time I found it that I ran dump RAM, Explorer had left memory. So really fast. I know I'm getting close to the end. We can also use Sysmon to look for this. We can't see the suspended processes. However, we can do a parent process analysis. Look to see who's launching these programs. If you see a program like DLL host running by a user where its DLL host normally doesn't run by the user, look at what its parent process is, and if it makes sense that was executing it. If you see, that can point you back to the malicious program. Here are my resources. So overall, hopefully you saw that none of these techniques that the CIA uses and malware authors use are new or advanced. The VBR bootkits, the earliest I could find was 1987. How many people in here were born after 1987? About half. So the CIA is using techniques older than you to infect your computers, or malware authors are. I'm not going to pick on just the CIA. And all of them are detectable during incident response. There are very easy ways that we can use to find these techniques, and we're not. And that's why they're being used still by malware authors or state-level governments or APT or whoever. They're being used. That's all I have. I am out of time. I will be outside to answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you again for coming early on Derbycon.